NATO leaders are meeting this week in Brussels for the yearly summit. Now, traditionally, these summits were fairly routine affairs. The allies reiterated their common pledges. There was a discussion about commitments of the alliance, but on the whole, a lot of the agenda was prearranged and certainly predetermined. Not so this time. There are serious questions hanging over the alliance, both in terms of the internal commitment of its allies, but also crucially on the role of the United States and how US President Donald Trump sees the alliance in the future. I'm Jonathan Eyal, and I'm joined by Professor Malcolm Chalmers, our Deputy Director General, and by Emily Winterbotham from the Institute as well, who has looked a great deal of her professional life at NATO's operations in Afghanistan. Malcolm, first of all, there's a lot of discussion in Europe about Donald Trump himself. His opinions are, shall we say, unusual about the alliance, about the purpose of the alliance. He believes that it is an instrument to fleece the Americans. But how important do you think the US president is in this thing? Because on the one hand, you had his statements, which were unusual. On the other hand, you had the US Department of Defense committing perhaps even more resources to Europe than ever before.
There is clearly a disjuncture between what President Trump is saying and what the Department for Defense is doing. So it remains to be seen. I think it's still an open question as to who will prevail. My gut feeling is that on some of these key issues, Donald Trump is more likely to prevail than Jim Mattis, who seems to be losing authority as the months go on. And particularly in the area of trade relations, Donald Trump, after a period in which people felt he was, as it were, under control, increasingly he's asserting himself through his appointments and through his actions. And I fear, and I think many European leaders fear, that this summit could see him beginning to put more flesh in the bones of his deep skepticism about NATO. We shall see, but there's a particular concern, I think, about the summit meeting with President Putin in Helsinki immediately after the NATO summit. So it's not simply a concern about what he says at NATO, it's also a concern about what he says thereafter with President Putin.
Now, we will come back to perhaps to the question of Putin, but I wonder if I could, the US president took a rather unusual step of writing personal letters to leaders of governments of countries that have failed to meet the 2% of GDP spending pledge, as he put it. Now, I had a look at some of his letters sent to the Norwegian Prime Minister, and it was actually quite decently composed. It argued that it understands that countries have difficulties in spending on defense, but that Washington will not accept continued lackadaisical attitude from the Europeans on defense expenditure. Do you think that this sort of very heavy-handed approach to Europeans who are not at the moment spending 2% of GDP can actually move things along, or is it part of the problem?
Well, since 2014, since NATO's defence investment pledge at that time, and perhaps more importantly, since Russian intervention in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, almost every NATO European state has increased its defence budget in real terms, and most continue to do so. We've always seen the United States presidents, President Obama and all his predecessors had complaints about European defence spending. That's nothing new. They were intensified after 2014 under President Obama. The worry is the what else implicit in some of those letters. The idea when an American president says something is unacceptable and it nevertheless happens, because not every European country is going to spend 2% next year. If countries don't do what the Americans are telling them to, what happens then? Is the United States then no longer a member? Is there a conditionality attached to it? And I think President Obama and all his predecessors, Republican and Democrat, were clear that the American commitment to NATO was unconditional. They like better burden sharing, yes, but it was still unconditional. With this president, it's less clear whether that's an unconditional pledge for the United States, or if Norway doesn't spend 2%, does that mean the next time Norway's in a crisis, the Americans will not come to their help? That would have been a nonsensical question to ask under President Obama or President Bush. It is not a nonsensical question to ask under this president.
But look at it from the American perspective. You know, you have a rich country like Germany running large budget surpluses. Indeed, one of the questions for the new coalition government in Germany is how they will spend the budget surpluses that they will rake up over the next 4 years. And yet, seems completely unwilling to move beyond the 1.3, 1.4% of GDP expenditure by the end of the current coalition government in Berlin. Is this acceptable? Does it show any particular willingness? Could someone like Trump not say that banging the table is the only way to get the Germans to wake up from their sort of lethargy?
But the relatively low level of defence spending in Germany compared with the UK and France is not a problem of the last year or 2 years. It's a problem, if it is a problem, that's been there in European security since Germany first joined, West Germany first joined the alliance back in 1954. And to expect that suddenly to change, for the whole of German strategic culture to change because of increased pressure from the United States, I think is quite unrealistic. And what the Germans will say, quite rightly, is that the 2014 NATO summit pledge was never for countries to meet 2% in 2018. It wasn't even for them to meet it in 2024. It was for countries who were spending less than 2%, such as Germany, to aim to move towards it, which is indeed what Germany has said. Germany has said that they will aim to spend 1.5% by 2024. Now, American commentators, American presidents have reinterpreted NATO's pledge as one that means everybody's got to spend 2% straight away, but that's something that European countries never agreed to.
Let's return to Emily and to the subject of burden sharing in a different way, in a much more practical way. The activities, the NATO operations in Afghanistan, which are enduring. Now, I heard someone saying in trepidation that waiting for Trump to arrive for the summit, that the first night of the summit is going to be a good one because they're going to talk about Afghanistan, and that the story there, at least in terms of burden sharing between allies, is still a good one. How do you see the NATO involvement in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the NATO alliance has played and continues to play a really significant role in supporting the Afghan National Security and Defence Forces. If you look back to the ISAF mission, which was in place up until 2014, before the handover to the Afghan National Security Forces, you had 50 countries collaborating in providing security in the country, 140,000 NATO troops. Since then, of course, we've had a significant reduction, which was always the plan, that we would, the West would be handing over to the Afghans themselves. But obviously, the NATO mission is still really important. So it's currently operating, the Resolute Support mission. The US still the key player within that. So, initial kind of decisions about troop numbers looking at about 8,400 in total from the US side, with 12,000 from all NATO allies, has since been increased. President Trump, when he launched his strategy on Afghanistan, said that there would be no more troop deadlines. The commitment to support Afghanistan was kind of indefinite. And we've seen an increase in US troops over the last 6 to 12 months, so currently around 15,000.
Did it surprise you?
The increase in troops?
From the Americans?
I mean, I think before Trump had come into power, people weren't really sure what his position was going to be on Afghanistan. Barely featured, if at all, in the elections and all of the presidential debates prior to the elections. And he himself had said on a number of occasions, we need to get out, this is a losing war. So I think when he launched his strategy, there was, I think, a realization that some of the discussions he'd been having with US defense chiefs had actually transmitted through, and that he realized that you couldn't just walk away. Clearly, though, there has been a shift under his presidency in terms of an increased focus on counterterrorism operations. So increased number of airstrikes, but then also this increased number of ground troops that we've seen, which, so far, depending on who you talk to, don't necessarily seem to have shifted the dynamics, but clearly the US is trying to demonstrate that it is a continued ally of Afghanistan. But in that, it's important that the US has other NATO allies, including obviously Germany, which is focused in the north, Italy in the west, the UK, obviously with numbers in Kabul, and considering actually an increase in British troops as well.
I may be asking an unfair question, but I'll ask it nevertheless. Do you think when the history of this period is going to be written, NATO will emerge well out of the Afghan story?
I'm not sure if you look at Afghanistan's history, anyone emerges well out of it. But, having worked in Afghanistan for 6 years, you did see at least significant collaboration between, a range of actors, which is hard to do in any context. The NATO mission did force a degree of collaboration. Obviously, the US, and to a lesser extent the UK as well, and Germany playing maybe a greater role. It can't be seen as a success in terms of mission success, because clearly, the Taliban is still waging an insurgency, Al-Qaeda is present, and of course we've got the kind of latest threat from ISIS or ISKP, ISIS in the Khorasan province. So success in military terms, no, but success in proving that an alliance can at least hold together in a shape or form, then yes.
So back to the subject of a habit of cooperation. The good, or the rather better side that the Secretary General of NATO would like to emphasize this week is going to be the so-called 30-30-30-30 initiative, the 30 mechanized battalions, 30 ships, 30 air squadrons to be deployed in 30 days. Now, to a large element, this is a packaging exercise, but do you think it manages to persuade people that this is a more nimble organization in decision-making and deployment capabilities?
I think it shows that when NATO as an organization and as a collection of country decides to change its priorities, it can do so. And this, of course, is a continuation of the quite significant shift of NATO away from an out-of-area focus, which was exemplified by the continuing Afghan operation, towards much more of a focus on Russia in particular, peer states in general, but Russia in particular, and the realization that in 2014 NATO was not well placed for deterrence of Russia. And
you mean when the Ukraine crisis started?
And there was understandable demand for greater assurance from NATO's newer member states in the East. And NATO, I think, step by step has delivered on that in a pretty consensual way. And it continues to do so, but there's more that needs to be done. And I think as you say, that great 30 to the power of 4 commitment is part of that. So when you look at the NATO communique, it will be full of consensus. It will be full of things everybody can agree to. Reading it will be very hard to see the divisions that exist in NATO. But I think the key element in deterrence of Russia is not how much we spend. It's not actually even our conventional capabilities. It's our cohesion as an alliance and Russian perceptions of cohesion. And I think the biggest risks to NATO, which this summit I hope will contribute to resolving rather than exacerbating, is to heal some of those divisions and to make it clear to President Putin or whoever it might be that we will stand together in an alliance. And that's partly about the United States and Europe, the uncertainty about President Trump. It's partly about Turkey, which is still a member of the alliance, but with deep differences with many other member states. It's partly about some of the East European members, and it's also partly about the rise of a populist movement and to some extent authoritarian movement in countries like Poland and Hungary and Austria and Italy. Because in the end, NATO gains its strength in part through its military capabilities, but also because it is seen to represent common values, so that people have a natural affinity. They want to defend each other because it seems natural, because we're all liberal democracies. The more that those divisions grow within the alliance and you have quite different ideological approaches, the more difficult it is.
Which leads me to the last question on the subject of Russia. I was always puzzled as to why Mr. Trump insisted so much on this summit, because he's under fire at home for being too close to Russia. There is still the controversy about his involvement, Russia's involvement in the 2016 electoral campaign in the United States. There is an enormous amount of opposition in Congress to any relations with Russia at the moment, rightly or wrongly. So the political benefits of this summit were very scant, yet the president seemed to have insisted on holding it. What do you think is his feeling? Is it like the Kim summit on North Korea, the feeling that he could fix the world's problems? Or is there something more substantial there?
There are, of course, all sorts of conspiratorial theories in relation to the funding base for the Trump business well before his election, which I don't feel qualified to comment on. But I think what he is doing in terms of this summit does reflect a worldview. There is, of course, a very personality-based view about Trump as an individual, has unique powers to solve problems. We've seen that in relation to the North Korea summit. But there's also, I think, a sense of a commitment to a different world order in which international organizations like NATO and the WTO and the EU are antithetical to American interests.
Are an encumbrance.
An encumbrance to America achieving what it wants. And we've even seen that in the American ambassador in Germany, openly encouraging far-right organizations in other European countries which are directly opposed to the policies of Chancellor Merkel. We've seen many examples of this. And in a way, I think, in terms of the Trump-Bannon worldview, a Europe whose security is guaranteed through bargains between major powers, even the way that Trump wants to talk to Germany and France, not to the European Union, it reflects this. A Europe in which, well, Crimea is naturally Russian, isn't it? So why are we bothering about Crimea is a Trump attitude, typically Trump attitude, which is very opposed to the rules-based approach, which has been the foundation of NATO and the EU. So in a way, it's the fact that he's giving so much priority to this is personal vanity, but I think it's also ideological ambition.
We'll have to stop it there, but I think it's a very thoughtful final remark. The fact that in many respects this will be a different summit. This will be a summit in which an American president will be there with a very different view of what the security relationship between his country and the world and Europe are likely to be. We are also, however, and it's useful to be reminded of how much the alliance has achieved. And as my colleague Emily has pointed out, a lot of it was about the habit of cooperation, the habit of working together, which anyone who's aware of European military history will know is an achievement in itself. Thank you to my colleagues, and thank you all for listening.